Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the mesmerizing reading by Mihal and the conversation that followed. We will now we have Aanchal, Anna, and Ishan on board, and we will now move on to the first panel discussion of today, uncovering diverse pasts with Anna Filomena, Amaral, Aanchal Malhotra, moderated by Eshan Sharma. In this panel, we hope to discuss history's invisibilization of marginalized voices, stories, and realities, and talk about the two writers' experience writing historical narratives. I will hand it over to Ishan to further this discussion.
Thank you so much, Yoshita. I hope I'm audible. Thank you so much.
Hi, Eshan.
Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Hi, Aanchal. Hi, Anna. And
Hi.
welcome to Long Weekend of Literatures, organized by Belong in collaboration with various European nations and embassies. And I'm truly honored to host this panel. And I think I would first like to give a small introduction to our speakers. I am Ishan. I'll be moderating the session. And with me, I have Ana Filomena Amaral, who is a Portuguese award-winning writer and an experienced translator in several languages, especially German. She has published 13 books in novels in Portugal, Mexico, Brazil, and the USA. And her novel Vaulted Home, Those Who Cheat Death, that we heard in the previous session, won the prize from Los Angeles Book Review, and she has participated in several literary festivals in Cape Verde, Brazil, India, and Beijing, and she is the director of Words of Fire, a literary festival in Portugal. Our second speaker, Aanchal Malhotra, is an oral historian, a writer based in New Delhi, and she is the co-founder of Museum of Material Memory, and she writes extensively on the 1947 partition and its related topics. Her first book, published in South Asia as Remnants of a Separation, that came out in 2017, and internationally as Remnants of Partition, that came out in 2019, was shortlisted for the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar, British Academy's Nafed Al-Rodan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding, Hindu Lit for Life Non-Fiction Prize, among other national and international accolades. So this evening we are going to talk about uncovering diverse pasts. One of Anna's famous work, Vaulted Home, explores the history of mankind by uh, centering the voice of a woman through all eras, and her writing deals with themes of dislocation, migration, refugee, ignorance, and apathy of a world full of geographical borders. Similarly, Aanchal also deals with partition, which offers a parallel view in the South Asian context. And I would first like to begin with the question that what do our speakers and our guests understand by the word diverse and the diversity that we are talking about? So I'll first go to Anna and then I'll come to Aanchal. Anna, over to you.
Yes, diverse. For me, the diversity in history tells the very, very individual history of any societies or any countries. For instance, when I talk about the Portuguese history is, of course, and logically diverse from the British history or French history. So all histories, our collective history and memory, because when we speak about history, we are speaking about memory, and that is very important that we remember that without history, there is no memory. And I think that the diversity is the matrix of history, but it's also the diversity of the different approaches of the different perspectives that every person has of its history. And for instance, if you talk with me about our Portuguese history, I have my insight of our Portuguese history. But if you talk with another colleague from me about the same, probably he has another approach and he makes a diverse interpretation. So, and if you talk, for instance, with young people, they probably have if they know the history, that is the question, they probably have another and diverse perspective of their history. And for me, for instance, memory is very important, but when you talk with young people, they still have a very short memory. So really, history is, we can say, the essence of diversity, because it is in its essence diverse, not only the history of each country, but the history seen by each individual of each country. And that is the power, and that is the interest of history too.
Thank you for mentioning about individualism, and I'll come to that. But before that, Aanchal, over to you.
So many similar thoughts echoing in my mind because I work with people's stories. And when I think of diversity, the first thing that comes to my mind is the multitude of voices that make up history. And as Anna said, the people who lived through that time. I write on partition, and the first thing I noticed when I started doing my research was how every person perceives partition in a different way, whether it is because of their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion, their age group. And I feel like when I started speaking to people, and I think this is the case for many oral historians who work on historical events where people are still around to share their insights of that time, they will see that there's no one perspective to look at history. And the minute you start stringing diversity into your research, it becomes more holistic, it becomes more authentic, and I think it becomes more representative. And for me, I found myself unlearning a lot because of diversity, which I think is like the hallmark of a good researcher, to look beyond your personal perspective. So many similar things, Anna, a lot of your answer resonated a lot with me.
Thank you.
So, you talked about the individual voices and how we have to weave the narrative through those voices. But do you agree with the point that in the kind of history that was written and that is being studied, the essence of individual is missing? We do not talk about individual, but we talk about communities or religions or groups of people. What are your takes on that, Aanchal?
It's complicated because I have often heard oral history. Firstly, oral history doesn't get the kind of importance that it deserves. Not just in India, I feel like all over the world, it deserves a lot more value as a source of history, historical information, because people speak about their experiences in their voice, in their words, in their language. That being said, I can only speak from my perspective, the story and history of partition, and I feel like it is highly devoid of individualism. And what that does is, to simplify something almost means to like uncomplicate it. I don't know, I don't think I'm explaining it in a good enough way, but humans are very complicated. And if we look at something as entwined as partition, where let's say you perceive something about certain religious communities, but the stories that you record may say something absolutely different, which means that somewhere between community histories and individual histories, there is a discrepancy. And I find, I don't know, I try and focus on, I'm not interested in the very big outline of the world. I'm interested in the very small, like how people feel, what they remember. And often the question about the veracity of history comes in. Is someone telling the truth about their past? Can you trust someone's memory? But, as Anna said, memory is what makes up a certain kind of history. There are blocks of memory that add up to historical events being remembered and passed down. And I always focus, I say, on the small H histories rather than the capital H histories, which to me seem very daunting. You know, yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, and Anna, over to you.
Yes, when we speak about history, there is always a concept that comes in my mind, and that is, for instance, we lived 50 years of dictatorship here, and the mainstreaming history was dictated by the dictators. So we have also, as historians, to look very well the sources from where we get the information for our history, because we also have to be very critical, because, you know, the main voice, it's not the only one of the historical process. And we really have to try to hear all the other voices that are not expressed in the mainstream history. And that is the work of an historian. Therefore, it's so important when we are digging. I am a historian, but I am an archaeologist. So it's important for me to dig not only the soil, but also the sources. And for instance, when you are reading original documents, you always need or if you have that possibility, to compare what the writers of that moment wrote about that, because it's a completely other perspective. And so you have a very diverse kind of documents that you really need to prospect and to dig if you want to have the chain of the story the most truly as possible, because truth is also another very, very tricky word. And you know, I was reading about this war that is now in the Western Sahara between Morocco and Sahrawi people and so on. People who lost or were robbed from their country 50 years ago. And if I talk with people from Morocco, of course, or a Spanish one, or a Sahrawi one, they will for sure have their vision of the history. But as an historian, you have to hear. It's also like a journalist. You have to hear all the voices so that you can make your mind and be the most, how can I say, truly possible, or to be near what is really happening, and to transmit that with accuracy, to be accurate in what you are writing and you are transmitting to the next generations. So it's really a very and you also have not only the written documents, you have the oral testimonies. And the oral testimonies are really very, very important, because to hear the voice of living people is not the same as reading a dead document.
Yes, and you both have mentioned about oral history and the problem with the mainstream history. I have I'll ask this question towards the end of our discussion, because I think it's very important to talk about. But you also mentioned, in some ways, a problem that we deal in India with the textbooks that we have for students, where we do not represent diversity enough. And that is one problem with the mainstream history, unfortunately. There are questions being raised on the school textbooks, especially history textbooks in India these days. So I'll ask this question to both of you. How was your experience, in Portugal, because you were a school teacher and for a very long time? And Aanchal, how was your experience as a student of history, dealing with school textbooks? So
You mean the history books that I, as a student, yes, of course. I still studied. My first years at school were still under dictatorship regime. So the books were only talking about the mainstream history. Of course, they will never talk. Even the text was censored. So the text that we used to learn Portuguese and how to read and how to write Portuguese, they were chosen by the regime. So those were the allowed ones. So then we have the forbidden ones, and so it's in a certain way, during almost 6 years, I was formatted in this main thinking of the dictatorship. And it's of course, I was very, very young, and then we had the revolution of the revolution in 74 and April 74, and of course everything, but I was still very young at that time. I was 11 years old. So but we felt the first sentence my mother said when I went home is, "Oh, something happened in Lisbon. They are all in the streets and fighting, and I'm so scared about your father, who did not yet return home from work." So these were the first. But then after 1-2 months, we heard, now we can speak freely, we can read freely. Now we don't have to be afraid of the political policemen. And this is a completely other history. Yes. And that's in every moments of the evolution of a country, we have really very different moments in history. And now, for instance, when I compare now the history books, they are really different, of course, because we live in a democracy, and because we can, they are not censored by the regime. So, and now we can really say and write what we want. But, and there is a but, there are still some voices that are not yet represented in this main history. For instance, women are still very underrepresented. For instance, LGBT community are still very underrepresented. Represented. So the minorities, for instance, we don't speak about gypsies in our books, and we have a gypsy community. So as all the countries have, I think the gypsies are spread around the world. So these are the voices that still in a democracy are not enough heard.
Definitely, and I think that's an interesting issue that we'll deal in this conversation. Aanchal, how was your experience?
Well, I grew up in Delhi in the 90s. I studied in the CBSE curriculum, and let's talk about the history curriculum, because that's really what the panel is about. When I learned history and I studied it all the way till the end of high school, I think I have to say that it is the first introduction that any young person has to the history of their nation, which means that the curriculum plays a very big role in forming our perceptions of the past. I think that I was taught history in a way that was so removed. It made me feel like my history had no impact on my present, which I think is quite a shame, because when we learned about partition, for example, we learned about the Indian independence movement. The first thing I should have done when I learned about these things is come home and ask my family, hey, did you live through this? Did you witness it? Did you see it? But I never did that, because I was never encouraged to do that. I found now in retrospect, if I think back, I found the curriculum not only reductive, but also quite flat in the manner of teaching. My teacher did not was not interested in exploring what had happened in the past. She was just very much interested in getting with the text. And like, I think when I teach someone about partition, I want to do it in a way that makes it not just personal, but also immediate, that shows me and shows my audience that, you know, this is what happened in the past, and look at how it's continuing to impact our future. Maybe not the big ways that you think, but look at all these small ways that it has woven into the fabric of your present day life. So I think this element was vastly lacking when I was there. I come from a family of refugees. 4 grandparents of mine came from across the border when India-Pakistan split in 1947. So when the word partition was introduced in class, I should have clicked and I should have said, oh, wait, 4 refugees at home, I should ask. But I never did it because I don't think that it was taught in a way that I felt like that history was mine. It was taught in a way that I had to just memorize it and regurgitate it on an exam sheet. It wasn't a personal history. So that was a very big problem when I was in school. Now, several years have passed, and I have been seeing consistently the textbooks for the past maybe 5 years, maybe more, and they have something called oral history in it. They have introduced oral history, they have introduced women's stories of the time, they have introduced texts, books of oral history that are like recommended reading alongside your textbook. And I find that so helpful because that means that students are listening not just to, okay, so and so pact was signed and so war happened, but okay, this is how this woman in this village felt when this took place. Now, it's just a very kind of token into that history, but at least it's a beginning. The other thing that I appreciate, at least about the CBSE curriculum now, is that they require every student in grade 12 to do an oral history project, which means that they need to interact with someone who has lived through an event of history, or interact with someone who has written about events of history, which means that they are introduced to the process of conversing about history, asking questions about the past, which I think is vastly lacking in subsequent generations. And I think what it also does is it teaches people how to listen to, let's say, an older person who is remembering things. You know, listening is a very important part of writing history, particularly when you write living history. You need to inculcate people's words, you need to translate them onto the page, which means sometimes you need to put yourself in their shoes, you need to empathize with them. And I think that by encouraging students to do oral history projects, you're putting them in situations where they have to listen and interpret the past themselves, which is a step in the right direction, I think.
I think that's a ray of hope uh,
Yes.
in India.
Yes.
But I'll come to Anna for the teacher's perspective. You mentioned about the teachers in India. I'll come to Anna now to have her perspective as a teacher in Portugal about history.
Yes, I think that teachers, of course, in every disciplines have a major role to play in each country, in each society. But one thing that it's very important for me, and it's still beginning in these historical studies, is that I think history is, of course, as by definition, the study of the past. But I think it shouldn't be only that. I think as the past and the present shapes the future, I think that when we are teaching history and we are speaking about history, we should think critically how this history should teach us to shape a different future. So not only staying in the past or even in the present, but already taking these tools of history and try to build the future. And that is the major role of history today, in my opinion, because we know we made mistakes in the past. We know that we didn't learn with mistakes in the past. We know that we are making the same mistakes in the present. But please, let's think about the history of future. It may sound like a paradox, but it isn't. And if we think this way, maybe we are not making the same mistakes in the future again. And that is the most important issue when we think now about what's happening in the world, about all the tragedies we are living in this moment. Is the main question is this: do we want to shape the future as we shaped the past, or do we want to shape it differently? And finishing with all these tragedies and catastrophes that we are living at the moment.
Yes, and I think that is a sad part of history, that we do not really learn anything from it, and that is half of the root cause of our problems today. Uh, you both mentioned about women's history, and the scenario is that in mainstream history, women are not given their due credit of history. And somebody was telling me, we are studying his story but not her story. you know that's kind of segregation that we do with the women, and also the uh, diversity at large, the LGBTQI community and others. I'll come to the women's question, because you both deal with women in your books. In Vaulted Home, you give the history of mankind through the feminist perspective, through the eye of a woman. Aanchal, you also deal with stories told by women in your book, especially of your grandmother, Hansla Chaudhary, and many others. So, in history, women's are largely invisible, unfortunately. So, I would like to have your comments on these issues, on the issue of women in history. So, I'll start with Aanchal, and then I'll come to Anna.
I during my field research for my work, I recorded stories of a lot of women in India and Pakistan and in the diaspora, and I feel like there is a different aura to the space when you are speaking to a woman. Stories of the past are often dominated by men. In our society, it's simply because the society is patriarchal, and the man often speaks for the family. So when I did speak to women who were sitting with the family, they were often reticent to open up, or they had a man speaking for them. I remember distinctly, I did this interview in Jammu, in North India, Jammu and Kashmir, and I was speaking to a woman who had lived through partition and a specifically gory incident in the area of Mirpur, which is now in Pakistan. And every time I would ask her something, she would look to her son to know if she could answer it. And to what extent she answered, honestly, I cannot say, but I feel like that, that gesture of hers encapsulated a lot of what it means to record women's voices, or what it means to understand the history of women. Um, the women that did open up did so in confidence to me. And their stories were very unique. I found, if I'm comparing now male histories to women's histories in the area of partition studies, I will say that more than often women mentioned about the family structure. This was a very big thing that came up again and again: how to restart family, how many of them sold their jewelry to start life in a new place as refugees. And I don't know, I don't solely focus on women's stories, so there are many other writers who write specifically on the issue of women and partition. But I did find that it helped me see how women have no choice but to remain silent sometimes because of the society, not just in the words they were saying, but also the words they weren't saying. So much of oral history is not about what is said, but what is gestured, what is shown through the movement of the body. And it is still, I would say, despite the amount of work done on partition and women specifically, it is not enough. It is not enough because it doesn't holistically represent the various communities that were impacted by partition in a way that does justice to what they endured in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. So I will say there's a lot more work to be done, and it is being done.
Definitely. And uh, in particular, Urvashi Butalia's work on partition deals with the women's experience of,
Urvashi, of course, but also Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, and a lot of younger scholars are also looking at specifically at women's stories. So that gives me a lot of hope. Anam Zakria, Pakistani scholar, she recorded several women that lived through the 1971 um, creation of Bangladesh, division of Pakistan, Third India-Pakistan War. So it gives me hope that women are more and more, women's stories are at the center of historical events.
Yeah, so there is change happening, but we have to, promote that change.
I think that we spoke about this when we had our little discussion earlier also, that one thing I find interesting in those of us who write history and are women, I found this with myself. The notion, or I guess I would say the occupation of historian, when we think of it, the predominant image that comes to mind is a man. And I find it interesting that whenever there is a panel of historians who happen to be female, it always says women historians. We are always known as women historians. But a male historian is just called a historian. It is just a trend that I've seen. I don't know, maybe it's a South Asian thing, maybe it's an international thing, I can't say. But I find it funny, and I always notice it, that I am a woman historian, but my male counterpart is simply a historian.
I'll share a small anecdote here. I was reading Sai Prayanjape's book. She is a very famous filmmaker of the 70s in India, and she said, I'm often asked question, what difficulties did you face as a female filmmaker? And she hates the term female filmmaker because she says, what is different in me than the other filmmakers?
Yeah, but there is an inequality. There is an inequality in the way that I don't know. I'll just say that it took me a long time to find my place, because many of us, we have to carve our place in a world that is predominantly male.
Yes, and Anna, over to you.
Yeah, that is very interesting because in my experience in these literary festivals, last time I was, I don't know, I think it was in Beijing, and I was asking the promoter, how many writers, men and women do you have here? Oh, women, we have very few. And I then asked why. Oh, because the men writers are more known and more, they are more translated, and they are more. And I thought, but this is right. This is what's happening in the literary festivals and in other festivals. Even if we are the majority of the population, we still aren't majority of the opinion makers, of the politicians, of the directors, we still are in minority. And thinking about this, I have to say that no one will give us nothing. We shouldn't expect that society says, Okay, so now we are going to have an equal quote of men and women in literary festivals or any other things. No, no one will do that. We were forced here in Portugal to have equal quotes in elections, I say in the government, I say in the parliament, but it was imposed. It was a law. Because if it's no law, we would be in minority everywhere in Portugal, in the decision places. So what I'm saying is that we have already 300 years of fight, but we still have to continue because we still in Portugal have inequality of wages. We still in Portugal have in the jobs interviews, if you are pregnant, you are immediately, they don't say of course, but you are immediately eliminated. If you say naively that you want to have a family and to have children, you are eliminated. So, and this is a country, a very, a country where we almost don't have active population in 10 years because we are all old. And there are no politicians who see this and implement measures to contradict this evolution. So this is a major problem in Portugal, and we still pregnant in a job interview are eliminated. So we still have a long way ahead. But we really have to do, each one of us have to do our part. But the unfairness of this is that now women work outside, women continue to be mother, women continue to manage the home, to manage all the work, or now we have 4 jobs instead of 1 when we were at home and didn't work. So this is much more difficult for us than for any man. And of course, we already share occupations at home and tasks at home, but the main responsibility, for instance, I give you this example. My son went to the university and he came to me to say, goodbye, mom. Okay, and I had to say very, very like in a low voice, yes, goodbye. Yes, but they come to me. Normally, children come to the mother. So we still have to fulfill these roles, and the others, of course, if we work outside in a somewhere.
And how do you reflect the space given to women in history in Portugal?
How I didn't understand.
How do you see the role or the space given to women in Portugal or Portuguese history?
No, of course, we are ignored. We still are ignored in Portuguese history. We still are silenced in Portuguese history. We still are a secret, a very well-guarded secret in the Portuguese history. But it's in our hands to write other words where women are present. So because probably men will not do that. And we still have to think that we were writing through centuries with a male name because we were forbidden to use a female name. So we still have to, we conquered a lot, of course we had, but we still have a lot to conquer.
Eshan, I want to add something here. If I think about the way in which family history or oral history is propagated down the generations, I have noticed that it's usually the matriarchal figure who shares stories, particularly, I speak of partition, so particularly stories of an erstwhile home or a land left behind, or even the riches or lack thereof that was present at the time. And it's almost always from grandmother to granddaughter, grandmother to grandson. Not to say that men don't share these histories, but I feel like women sort of inculcate them into the daily activities of life, even in the food that we eat at home. Like my grandmother talks a lot about the food she used to eat before they migrated as refugees, or the habits or the fields, you know. So I feel like the landscape of the past is often evoked by the matriarchal figure in the family. Not always, but quite often.
Yes, and I think too that we have to perspective the history in two different ways, because we have a different role in these two ways of the history. One is the public way, the public life, and that is of course dominated by men, and the other one is the private life, which is for sure dominated by women. But this private life is still not yet completely written. It began only in the last century. And we really have to explore this private life and to write this private life in the perspective of the history, because there, I'm sure we are dominating the whole history.
Definitely. Thank you for such interesting perspectives on the women's part, which is often
Oh.
I think we lost him.
am I
Yes,
back? I'm
okay.
really sorry.
Yes.
I'm really sorry. There's some internet issue. I'm really sorry for that.
Yeah.
But as I was saying, um, you both brought about the perspective of women, which is often very secretive, as Anna said, while she was explaining the role of women in history. Now, this brings me to the question of what role does a storyteller like both of you play in breaking down the barriers? Because talking about women's history, or history, especially in India, history of people who are Dalits or quote unquote untouchables, there still are barriers. And I ask this question because Anna, in her book Chaste Walls, talks about the destruction of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and and one of her interviews she also recalled that walls only had meaning when they were constructed by women. And
I think we have
Yes,
lost Eshan
yes, we
again.
lost him.
Yeah, we will, I think, can wait.
Yes, I don't know.
I think, yeah, I think Eshan is back. Um, oh no,
No, he will. Ah, he's back.
I
you're
connected with
not
my this.
audible.
Am I now?
Yes, yes.
I'm really sorry. I already put the audio silent, so I'm really sorry for that. So I was asking you both about the role literature plays or a storyteller plays in breaking down the barriers, where women's past, or say in context, the history of the Dalits, untouchables, are still, behind the barriers, and people don't really try to break down those barriers. Anna, in her book Chaste Walls, mentioned the breaking of those barriers, where in one of her interviews, Anna mentioned that walls existed in the medieval time. They had meaning to save the nation from invaders or diseases. But in the modern age, those walls doesn't exist or doesn't hold a meaning. So as storytellers, how is your role in breaking down those barriers? I'll first come to Anna and then I'll move to Aanchal.
Yes, I think that art in general, not only literature, should break all the barriers, should break all the walls, should break all the indifference, injustice, inequality, the art in general, but literature in particular has a very, very important role to play in this issue, because as I wrote in the Chasing Walls, because all my writing career began with the Berlin Wall. I'm going to tell you only this short story so that you understand why walls are so important for me. My first book was called A Door Opened with Fire, and I wrote it in 1989. And you know that this date is the date of the fall of Berlin Wall, because I was in Berlin in August, and I was in the Ost part of Berlin. I saw the wall, everything, and I was so impressed with this reality. Then when I came home, I wrote this book in 1 month. I didn't do anything else, only writing. And this book came out precisely 1 month later, after the Berlin Wall fall. So the Berlin Wall fall on 9 November and 1989, and my book came on 9 December 1989. It was a big success because it was seen as a kind of, how can I say, vision of the Berlin Wall fall in the future. So I was a kind of pronunciation of the Berlin Wall fall. And so since that period, that walls are connected, very connected with me, and they really touch me and impress me a lot, because in the Middle Ages, walls were naturally built to protect the populations and the cities and the villages from enemies. But nowadays, we are protecting from what? From other people who seek refuge, from other people who are fleeing from war, from hunger, from climate disasters. What are we protecting us from? And in this book, I go through the walls that still remain. For instance, the Berlin Wall fall, but we still have North Korea, we still have Belfast, we still have Western Sahara, we still have Mexico, we still have Kashmir. So we still have so many walls. And this journalist is chasing these physical walls, but also chasing the inner walls. And those are the most difficult to put down, because all this intolerance, all this discrimination, all this fanatism, all these are inner walls that we build every day, and we don't construct every day, and we should do it. But we are every day building more physical ones, but inner ones too. And here, the literature has a major role to play, to denounce, to expose, and to shake people to be aware of that, to make them conscious of what is happening. Therefore, I say that my books have always a very, how can I say, a very bothering message. So it's not something very pink that with a very happy ending. No, it's really like a rose. It has the beauty of the rose, the smell of the rose, but the thorns of the rose too, Yeah.
That's a nice way to put it, actually. Uh, So I'll come to Aanchal, the role of literature in breaking down the barriers and bringing about the diversity that we are talking about.
Ishan, something I think about a lot is why I started doing the work that I do. Of course, it's to bring about educational interest of people like me, young people like me. But I think as the years have passed, that aim has morphed into something larger, like creating some form of peace between the common people of India and Pakistan. A peace that has not, that no one has seen since 47. And I think a lot about this, that can my voice change the opinion of the masses, both in India and Pakistan? Can the historian, can books actually help us to unmake the other? Because what we are trying to do is deconstruct the other, and who the other is simply someone who is different from us. um, when I was in Pakistan, I sat in on an interview with a couple who were telling me that when partition happened in 47, one of them, the man, was nearly killed to death on a train. And then his wife went on to say that Hindus are very intolerant. They did this to my family. They did this to people I know. And she was talking about Hindus in a way that made me think that she didn't realize that I was Hindu. And so I said to her that, you know that I'm Hindu, right? And the couple said to me, you're not Hindu. You're like our daughter. So in in speaking to them, I had somehow, I don't know how, transported myself across the border from being not just the other to, but to being like a family member. And I think that made me think a lot about why we other people. In this case specifically, why Indians other Pakistanis and why Pakistanis other Indians. And I think about this a lot when we meet overseas. When we meet in the UK or the US, we don't care if someone is Indian or Pakistani. We care that they speak our tongue and they eat our food, and we laugh the same way and we swear the same way and we feel the same way. But somehow, when we are back in our territories, when there is this big Radcliffe border between us, the line between us, we are territorial of our territories in a way that makes no sense sometimes. But I am not a politician and I cannot bring about peace in a political way. So, what I try and do is bring about peace in a way that is common to us through conversation and language and memory and history. And I don't know whether one person is enough to bring about that change, but I know that that is the only way the change will come about. When we within ourselves understand that someone on the other side of the border was once ours, and this border between us is a man made border, which means that the natural land is an unpartitioned land. And I think this is why people's stories and the diversity of stories is really important, because it helps us to humanize someone we don't understand. We may not even, for people that may have never met a Pakistani in their lives, they may say they hate Pakistan, but they don't know why. They understand public perception, but they don't understand the intimacy of history. And I think that intimacy, that warmth, that storytelling comes from listening to someone's memories from history. So, do I think that a historian can break down barriers or literature? Yes, I'm optimistic about this, but I know that it takes several generations to do it because it is a mindset change. You change the mindset of several generations to actually see change in society, actual change, sustainable change.
Definitely. And this brings me back to the question of the problems of mainstream history, because the quote unquote others that you mentioned, the creation of this others is obviously a very old, unfortunate tradition. But with the coming of the Britishers, with the colonialism that we witnessed, this othering became more prevalent in societies and in history writings, I believe. So, how do you see the effects of colonization on history and also the process of decolonization. So, are we completely decolonized, or is it a continual process that goes on for ages?
I don't think that we may be physically decolonized, but we are certainly not mentally, emotionally, we're not decolonized that way. I have spent the last several years working on a book on the generational impact of partition, interviewing Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, diaspora, and the number of people who talk about the politics between India and Pakistan, or Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Bangladesh, is disproportionately high to the number of people who say that all that we are feeling, experiencing, enduring is because of decolonization. Everyone talks about India Pakistan politics. No one says anything about the British, which means that that history has receded so far back into memory, at least in common young people, people our age, that it doesn't seem to play a role. But it is, in fact, the reason why we have the many geopolitical issues in our part of the world. Decolonization is very much alive, not just in the physicality of spaces and how things are still in flux from partition, but also in our minds. We are very quick to judge the Pakistani, but we have no qualms in going to London. We have no qualms at all. We don't think of them as the colonizer anymore. Very few. I mean, I don't want to generalize. Not to mention that in Britain itself, the history of colonialization is not discussed as frequently, openly, or as much as it should. Like, only now, I think, in the past few years, has it been made a part of certain curriculums in the school. We that the reason why so much immigrant population lives in Britain, or how Britain ruled India for X number of years, X hundreds of years, is not discussed in the curriculum. Children don't know about it. So I don't know. I feel like I don't even remember what your question was. I feel like I've gone on so many tangents now, but we are not completely decolonized by any means in our minds.
Yeah, my initial question was the uh, creation of the other under colonialism.
Yeah, and I think that's where it has taken center stage in a lot of my conversations. We are very happy to talk about who we think the other is and why perceptions of the other have grown and how they make us feel, uh, how we feel fearfully when in the presence of the other. But I think, how do you unmake the other? How do you unmake the other? That is really something I keep at the back of my mind. In the way that partition is represented in our public memory, the division of India and Pakistan is represented as an event of extreme violence, where one community um, did violent acts on another community, Hindus on Muslims, Muslims on Sikhs, Sikhs on Muslims. It is incredibly violent, and I think it unfairly portrays the spectrum of emotion that may have existed at that time, which leads us to the diversity of narratives. I think about the fact that it can't all possibly have been violent. It was certainly quite violent. But in that violence as well, there were friends that would never see each other. There were brothers, one in India, one in Pakistan. There were girlfriends, two girls that went to school together that would never see each other. There were neighbors that parted, lovers whose marriages fell apart, people who came together in camps because of partition. My grandparents met in a refugee camp and got married. So I don't know, I feel it's all, I guess, a bit linked together. When you start to unmake the other, you start to open your mind to the diversity of narratives that exist within history. If that makes sense. At least I know that's what I did when I started doing my research. It was everyday unlearning, unmaking.
And I think as a historian, that process of unlearning and also, relearning at the same time
Always, yes.
is very important. It's very, yeah. And I'll come to Anna now and her perspective on the effects of colonialization and the creation of the other in 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 history. So if you can reflect on that, Anna.
Yes, for me, this colonization was probably one of the darkest moments of European history. Not only Portuguese, of course, but European history. And the problem is that we have a major debt to these countries where we were colonizers. And this debt is not being paid. On the opposite. And I'm not speaking about India, where Portuguese people also colonized. I'm speaking more about Africa, where Western economy, European economy, continues to colonize. And if it's not the colonization in this very basic meaning, is the exploitation. And now not only Europe, but China came too. So the African continent is now being torn apart again because of our greed, because we need the ores they have in their soil, because we need everything that they have in their countries. And these people live in absolute misery, again, because a new kind of colonization. So we are not paying that, and we are doing worse, still worse than we have done. And so I think that in this perspective, we really don't see the other. We really don't see the other the way we see ourselves. I would not like to say the word that is coming to my mind, but these others, we are still seeing them as slaves, not as human beings who should live with the dignity of human beings, and they aren't. So I think that we still didn't recover from the mentality of colonizers. And that hurts me very much, because this is one of the biggest mistakes of our history, and we didn't yet learn from it.
That's a very important point. Uh, would really announce this to all our viewers and listeners that if you have any question to any of
If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to send in your questions at the question box at the bottom of the screen. I think Eshan is again frozen.
It's frozen again. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Zoom, or if you are on, if you are on YouTube. I'm back. Yeah, there was a call. I'm
Okay.
really sorry. But I was saying, as I was saying, if our audience have any questions for our speakers, I would request them to send them in the Q&A section that you see on the Zoom call, or if you're watching it on YouTube, please drop them down in the live chat. Now, coming to the second question, because you all pointed to one important thing throughout the conversation, that is the importance of the marginalized voices and how they shape, because it's like a mosaic. You connect all different, it's like puzzle, it's like a jigsaw puzzle that you connect all different pieces together and it creates a beautiful landscape. That is how these different diverse parts that we are talking about constitute our collective sense of history. But in reality, in today's world, we are missing those pieces. And people like Aanchal, people like Anna are trying to put those pieces together to create a sense of belonging within nations, and trying to create a borderless literature that is the need of this hour. We have an age-old culture in India called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the whole universe is a family, and this is what Anna also tries to show in her book Vaulted Homes that she read this evening on track one of Belong. My question is, how do we, because we have talked about what are the challenges, but what should be the course of action in mainstreaming those marginalized voices? It's a difficult question, but I think it should be asked to our speakers. So, Anchal, I would like you to go first, and then I'll come to Anna.
Um, I want to say that when I wrote Remnants, it's not that there wasn't any oral history out there. There certainly was. Um, you mentioned Urvashi, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, even someone like Anis Kidwai. They wrote the history of people. But I think that something really interesting happened when Remnants came out. It was the 70th anniversary of independence and partition, and it made a lot of people reconcile, maybe not reconcile entirely, but certainly reflect on what had happened. And there was a need to tell stories. I'll give you an example. In my own home, the history of partition had never been discussed. It was, at best, maybe inserted into regular conversation through things as mundane as, oh, that was the name of our village, or we used to eat this. It was never like, I came from here and this is what happened. I was never told that. But when I started asking my grandmother, she said, ask me quickly before I forget, which meant that either no one had asked her about the past, or she had not thought it necessary to be told until that point, or maybe she hadn't felt comfortable or didn't know how to talk about it. But what was certain is that she wanted to have it out at that point. And I feel like a lot of people I interviewed, because they were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, some even over 100, felt that time that they were getting older, their history would never be remembered or passed down, came to dawn upon them. But in writing Remnants, I also noticed that there are certain histories that I cannot write because I cannot speak for communities that are not mine. And I think that this is a very important acknowledgement for myself. Like, you speak of Dalit history, and I know that there needs to be a Dalit history written from the time of partition, and I know someone who's writing it, but I don't think I could have done it justice. That is not a community whose voice I represent, and I don't think I could have fully done it justice. Same for the LGBTQ community. I don't know if there were narratives of that time that existed, but I don't think I was the right person for it. What I was the right person for is the refugee experience of the major provinces of Punjab and Bengal. And I feel like even those did not have a mainstream acknowledgement. We still don't have a monument of partition. We don't. We have a museum of partition finally, but we have no monument acknowledging, we have no place where people can go and say, this is mine. I think that people, what I found speaking to people who had lived through partition is that they were finally being seen by someone who wanted to see them. This visibility, the aspect of visibility is really important when a story is marginalized or has not come into light for many years, either by the choice of the community that has kept silent or by the fact that no one has asked. No one thing can be held entirely responsible. But this is where the art of oral history is important, because it allows communities that have been marginalized in mainstream history, in academic history, in histories written by the colonizer or the educated at a certain period of time, They allow these marginalized histories to be recorded and voiced with dignity, respect, and in the words that the community chooses. I think that this is what I came to learn through my experience, and this is why I treasure the art of oral history and conversation, perhaps above all else.
Yeah. Anna, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I was thinking, if I understood well, you were asking in what direction should we go so that these marginalized voices could be heard, yes? It was this? Yes. Okay, so I think there is one word very, very, very important in our way and our path, and the word is inclusion. We can only have a future if we convince ourselves that the other is not another, no, the other is ourselves, and we have to include him in our history. I know you can say, you can think, this is an utopia, but yes, the future can be an utopia. It's in our hands to make this utopia true and real. The other word that is very, very important for me, but is tolerance. But when I say tolerance, it's not to tolerate the other. No, it's not to tolerate the other. It's to include the other in our lives. It's to see the other as ourselves and to understand their needs as ours, because they are the same. Is to understand that they need to live with the same dignity we do. So this this is the only way we have to move forward. But it's not only thinking about human beings or human race, is also thinking about life on the planet and life of the planet itself. This is the only path we can really follow, because otherwise we are condemned. And it's very, very sad.
Yes, and I asked this question because, in various parts of this world, we are seeing an upsurge in radicalization and, the increase in orthodoxy in religion and everything. And the first attack is always on the history. All these dominant powers always attack history first. They make changes according to the narratives. And that is why I think this question was necessary to ask the historians and scholars who have a major role to play in the world today when we are seeing such changes, such radical changes happening all over. And I think our viewers are intelligent enough to decipher the unsaid, and maybe they can read up more, and especially Aanchal's book and Anna's works that are available on Amazon and other platforms. Uh, a question I think that would interest both our speakers and also our audiences, the question of translation. We talked about translation with Anna in the last session, but now that uh, there is a twofold translation, and the question is also a twofold question. That first, you are recording an oral narrative. You are translating the other the person's ideas and stories into your own words and weaving a story yourself. That is the first fault of the translation process. Secondly, the book is also being translated into several languages, so it's going to the third hand, who is the translator. How do you see the process of translation from the first fold to the second fold, which also reaches to a larger audience of different languages? So, Anchal, because you deal with people who are in their late 80s, 90s, who witness partition, and there is a two different cultures interacting. You
Hmm.
belong to the third generation, and they are the first generation. Tell us something about that process.
Yeah, I have to say that when I started my work, I was in my early 20s. I was 23. I had spent 7 years in Canada, conveniently trying to forget my native languages and speak in English always. And when I returned to India, I found it very hard to have intimate conversations with people in Hindi or Urdu. As a result, when I listen to my earliest interviews, they are in broken Hindi, Punjabi, English, Urdu. And that is such a mistake on my part, because the more I started to familiarize myself with my own language, the more my interviewees opened up. So now, as you rightly mentioned, translation is multifold. In my process, more than often, the interview is in a regional language, a person's language: Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, Gujarati. And if I can't translate it, then I have a translator or a member of the family translating as we are speaking. So that is a translation from one language to another, right? When I start writing, I further translate the narrative into something that is cohesive in a way that also doesn't lose the immediacy of the language. So, what I always do is leave certain phrases or words of how what people said to me. In India, we speak in a single sentence, we may speak many languages. And I think that that is so, it's like the color, you know, the texture of how we speak is like that. And I wanted to reflect that in my book, because I write for my people. And so I did that. I left many words, many phrases. But then another form of translation happens, where you are translating the landscape of the past into a landscape that is understood by the present. So you are not just translating, but also transporting, which means that you are crossing the borders and the bridges of age. For me, this was really important. How do multi generational conversations happen? You know, because they may be explaining something, and because of my age difference, as you rightly mentioned, I may be understanding something totally different. So I found multiple translations, not to mention when, like you said, the book gets further translated, it, I think, adopts other cultural nuances of other cultures. Like my book is coming out in French now, in next week, in fact. And the series of conversations with my French translator were very interesting, because what I didn't realize is that Hindi and French, they are perhaps conjugated the same way. So anytime she would ask me very specific questions like, do you have a formal you and an informal you? And then she would tell me, yes, so do we, in fact. And we would have conversations about this. So I was very interested to know how she interpreted the book, which was very fruitful for me. The discussion was very fruitful. But as you rightly point out, like translation on multiple levels, not just linguistic, but also geographic and age related for me, generational.
And what about you, Anna?
Before going to translation, I would like only to say something about you said before, and that is very, very important what you said. We are globally living a pandemic. We are globally living a crisis, a major crisis. And we should be globally concerned with fanaticism, with extreme ideologies and extreme desires to get power. So please, this is very important, because in this moment of crisis, all kind of, how can I say, dark people raise from the dead. So, and about translation, I always think that translation is, even if we don't want, we as translator, translation is always a recreation. And I say this because the translation is always a dialogue between two persons, two cultures, two ways of thinking, two ways of thinking, two ways of living, because if I'm translating into Portuguese someone from Germany, so this is a dialogue. And of course, even if I don't want what I am and what I feel is, I cannot be so objective, and even the words cannot be so objective that we translate ipsis verbis what's in the main text or in the original text, because there is always a kind of interpretation that the translator must do, always, because a word in German is probably 10 words in Portuguese. Yes, you know, as the German language is likes, loves, the big words. So we have to translate them in 2, 3, 4, 5 words. So doing this, I'm already changing, not changing the meaning, but putting, as Aanchal was saying, put the texture of the Portuguese language in the text. I translated from the German. And this is very important, but may I ask, is it bad? I don't know. I don't know if it's bad. I don't think it is, because it's the only way to make a translation. Because if we don't, but we are incapable of doing this. Any translator can do a translation where the original meaning is 100% there. It's impossible. Because of the diversity. Because of the diversity in the languages, the diversity in mentalities, the diversity in feelings, it's like this. Translation is always a recreation. But here I have to say something that is very, very important, and we also have to be careful, is if we are serving other interests, that not the author, what the author wanted to express and to transmit. Because if we want to put the text accessible to the readers and how can I say, cleaning the text of what is difficult, or we as translators supposed to be difficult for the readers. So to serve the readers, that is a major, major problem. And that is not recreation. That is serving the audience or the readers, instead serving the author. And the author should come first, should always come first for a translator.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that interesting response. We have last 4 minutes for the session. There's an interesting question from the audience, and this is by some anonymous attendee. I'm not sure who he or she is. I'm really sorry, but the question is: how do you think things such as social media or digital content will change the writing of history going forward, and how can we make sure that future history is more inclusive and brings diverse vantage points? So, Anna, your quick response, and then I'll come to Aanchal.
So I think the social media are important. We have to use them very carefully. We have to protect us from them. We shouldn't expose our soul, our intimacy in the social media, because this is a major mistake. Because we all know once is in the social media, once is in internet, is forever there. And we really have to be careful. Also with some social medias that are controlled by some regimes, by some countries, we also must be very, very careful with the data we put there, because we don't know how these data are going to be used or misused. So social media are a very, very problematic issue, but I'm not against them. I'm only pro them with strict rules. That is very, very important. But of course, internet is very useful. Everyone, we couldn't be here, Europe and India together, if we have these digital means. So it's everything very, very important, even for literature too, because, for instance, if I write a book in English, everyone in the world almost can reach this book, can buy this book, can read this book. So it's very, very important. But we also have to be very careful about the way these media are used. And not always they are used for the best. For the best.
Yeah, Aanchal.
I'll just give a quick response. For people like me who work on cross-border narratives, any borders, anywhere in the world, social media, despite its perils, is a gift because it allows us to visually see beyond that border. A lot of scholars from India cannot go to Pakistan. A lot of scholars from Pakistan cannot come to India, which means often social media becomes our way of breaking down even visual barriers, if not emotional. That's my short, concise answer.
And one more perspective to this question, whoever has asked, there are students like us who are running different pages that you should,
Yes.
consider visiting, because we are trying to bring different narratives of the past, different fields of the past, not just political history or histories of about regimes and everything, but cinema or the women's history, Dalit history, food history, different types of history that are interesting and also diverse in their nature. So I would really recommend people to visit those pages on social media, but don't take everything on their face value. Research yourself.
The other part of this question about how we can make sure that future history is inclusive, I feel like part of it is already happening because we are more aware that it is not yet fully inclusive. So we will make sure the histories we write are more inclusive. But I think also history is not just a really academic history anymore, which means that even the periphery of history has opened up to allow for other things like, say, food history, which is such a fun and unusual kind of history. So I feel like it is already happening because of the kinds of people, like I don't come from a historical background and I am writing history. So I think there is a lot of crossover of disciplines as well that is ensuring a kind of inclusive, more diverse, more authentic history of communities.
Definitely, and our guests for the next panel are there. So I'll end this session because we were given 90 minutes, and to talk about diversity, it takes more than 90 days. So we tried to summarize everything in 90 minutes. We talked about diversity of genders, especially, then diversity of languages and translation. We talked about diversity of landscapes, where Aanchal mentioned about Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and sorry, Aanchal, yeah, and Anna talked about the Portugal, and how they are different at the same time, but also contribute to the history writing. We also talked about different diverse communities, such as in Indian context, Dalit history, and history of other the quote unquote other community, the effect of imperialism, and the problem with mainstream history. I hope this panel will result in opening up of discussions, further discussions, more and more work coming up on these diverse paths. And I hope we, even if one will be changed after this session, we will be successful in our approach. Thank you so much, Yoshita and the team Belong, for giving us this platform to talk about diverse past. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Asha.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Asha.
much.